collar at my throat hums like a wasp and tastes of warmed metal. Every breath could be my last if the wrist soldiers decide I've had enough. I was a Penal Legionnaire, expendable muscle sold to the Imperium, and what kept me alive wasn't courage. It was a ledger of debts I could never fully repay. The compliance collar bit into my skin with each small movement, a low staccato under the jaw that matched my pulse. When it pulsed harder, the world narrowed to the thickness of air between me and the man with the trigger in his gauntlet. Morning came in the same way on every world that took men like me, heat, grit, and a voice that had no patience for names. They called roll with a rasp that could hollow stone. Boots cut the thin crust of the ground in a steady rhythm. I learned the cadence before I learned the faces. The guards shouted, and the words slapped the dust names, cutter numbers, ranks that meant almost nothing until the order to walk someone out snapped a life into motion. I listened for the cadence that would spare me. I listened for the hiss that might mean release. We were more statistics than people. An 11, a 42, a joke someone had tried once and been made an example of. But the human noise clinging around those labels never quite disappeared. A cough, a muttered prayer, a rasp where someone had swallowed sand the night before. When a guard said the name to be walked out, it was always painfully ordinary, like handing over a bowl or a shovel. No trumpet, no sermon. Just a word and the sound of rope on skin. They walked him out slow. I watched his hands tremble the way a wounded animal trembles, not with fear only, but with the memory of a life fragment being prized loose. The guards never hurried when they were showing the rest of us how fragile our own minutes could be. Old scars glimmered across the man's knuckles. A faded tattoo tried to make sense of what the Imperium had stamped into him and failed. His collar pulsed as if counting down, but the beat could have been a nervous tick for all the change it made to the world. They led him toward a wire-girded trench where the smoke came up in lazy, oily ribbons and the air tasted like burnt feed. We watched until the trench swallowed his hips, and his name was only a shape made by dust and bootlight. They called us by number, but the numbers sometimes bent into names around the edges. Moss had a laugh that arrived late and stuck, a wet, surprised sound that made the guard snarl when he used it in the wrong place. Kier kept his head down and his fingers clean, as if he could rub the past off with soap. There was a boy, barely a man, whose collar sat loose on the throat and swung like a pendulum when he walked. He chewed the inside of his cheek until it shone with blood. None of them had been given much choice, and none of them believed the choices they'd been offered. A sergeant with a trimmed beard and the right kind of gauntlet handed me a task with the care of someone assigning a broom to sweep blood. He said it slow enough that the words left no room for mishearings. You clear the sap, you go first. He didn't look at me when he said it. His eyes measured something in the horizon, some tally of risk and life left. The sap lay like a mouth open to the sky, trenches cut into the earth, held together by splintered timber and sanctioned fear. Smoke crawled along the lip of the cuts, and the world beyond the trench looked as if somebody had rubbed a bruise into the horizon. The task was simple by design. Walk the narrow edge, check for trip lines, shout back if you see something alive and hostile, press a sap into the next position. The plan smelled of cannon waste and old leather, and the sergeant's palms smelled of disinfectant. Being told you must go first had an economy to it. Expend the men with no purchase on fear, and the rest of the unit keeps moving. They dressed the order up like strategy. The collar made it plain. I tasted grit. The wind tasted like metal, and bread gone stale. My tongue held the impression of heated iron from the collar, and the memory of other collars slipping, sparking, killing. The compliance collar was a small machine and a slow machine. It punished disobedience by pain at first, then by glimpses of release. I learned its language faster than I learned the sergeant's face. A quick pulse meant a warning. A long, low note meant break step. A sudden hot flash was a threat, but we rarely heard the snap, not if we wanted to live through the day. Sometimes the caller would stutter, and the guards would laugh like men sharing a private joke. Other times it hummed solemnly, as if marking something too heavy for laughter. My ledger ran across my ribs, not in ink, but in the memory of every choice that had led me to stand with heat and dust in my throat, and a caller that loved the sound of my silence. They handed me the tools of the task with no ceremony. A wire cutter, a stub of lamp, a length of tape that smelled faintly of tar. The lamp was nothing more than a trick of glass and a glow stick, but the glow fell across faces in ways that made promises. The wire cutter felt heavy as a confession. The sergeant clipped tape into my palm, his fingers clamped like a vice, and for a heartbeat he looked at me. I read more meaning in that look than in the words he hadn't spoken. He wanted a man who could be counted on to make the smallest movements while the world around him unraveled. He wanted someone who wouldn't flinch when a neighbor's collar expired. He wanted men who could be made an example of without making his own command look weak. We moved toward the trench line in a single, cautious spool of bodies. The sun lay across our shoulders, and the collars buzzed like insects sleeping in a jar. Dust filled my nose and throat. It settled in the hollows behind my teeth. Every step made a small ledger entry. One more breath, one more inch. The sound of the squad was the sound of restraint. Boots, cloth, the occasional curse choked off by the awareness that the guards stood close enough to make an example of any man who made too much noise. Shadows lay in the trench like sleeping things. From the lip of the earth, the trenches looked like the grooves carved into a jaw, clean, purposeful, designed to keep men in or out depending on who was counting. The first sap we passed had been freshly cut. In the bottom, cables and blackened timbers gave the impression of a maw that had been used recently. Smoke curled from a slit in the side, and the smell of it pulled at memory like a hand. Someone had tried to burn the timbers. The ash kept drifting up in thin veils that stuck to the collars of our jackets. My hands were clean because I kept them that way. Clean hands made you useful. Useful men lived longer than men who fumbled and bled. The sergeant tapped his gauntlet against the strap at my shoulder, as if to remind me of the weight of the world in my palm, then stepped back as the rule demanded. It was my turn to find the trip lines, my turn to move the saps forward, lip closer to the enemy. Fear is a geometry. It has angles you can predict and points you can avoid. I had gotten good at triangulating it. Keep your head low. Keep the lamp between you and the sun so it doesn't give you away. Breathe with the collar. The wire cutter closed around a glinting filament that might have been a trip line or might have been a discarded tether. The lamp threw shadows across the inside of the trench and made bright teeth of the timbers. My fingers felt the vibration from the collar like a trapped beetle. For a breath that lasted as long as a heartbeat, I tilted my face toward the sun and remembered another morning, before collars, before courts, where the air had smelled of different bread and not of smoke. The memory was a small, dangerous thing, because it made me briefly believe in a life that did not belong to the ledger. A voice from the rear barked a check. It was Moss, improbably alive in his laughter, checking the far lip for signs of movement. He said something small and sharp, something that could have been comfort or instruction, and the sergeant answered with a grunt. No one spoke too much. Conversation spreads like splintered timber out here. The sound of two men trading jokes could get you picked out to be the next lesson. So we conserved words like the poor conserve coin. The mission, when it came down to it, wanted men who bought silence in advance. That was the contract. You offered your throat to an oath, and they offered you the chance to walk another day. When I reached the edge where the trench narrowed to a knife, I felt the collar's hum grow keener, as if it tuned itself to the angle of my breath. My hands moved on muscle memory. Cutter, tug, peel, spool. The tape stuck the loose end back against the lip of earth without ceremony. Nothing screamed, nothing exploded. For a moment it felt like an illusion of safety, like a calm patch stitched into the warp of the battle. But the world around the illusion smelled of smoke, and the horizon gathered small clouds of powder like flies to a wound. The sergeant's gaze slid across the line toward me, and then beyond, toward the off-horizon where unseen guns set the day's tempo. His lips moved, silent words that were more ritual than command, and I passed the lamp back along the line until it reached his hand. He pointed with the gauntlet in a slow, precise arc toward the next stand of trenches, further in than any of us had gone that day. The order was simple and final. We would press the sap forward, inch by inch, until the wire told us otherwise, or a guard decided our usefulness had run out. I felt the ledger tighten under my ribs, more debt owed, more ground to be bought with steps that could be the last. And I did the only arithmetic that mattered. Count the breaths, count the tools, count the men at your back. Keep your hands clean. Make the smallest movements first. When the sergeant barked, "Move," the sound of the word rolled over the bones of the earth like a verdict. We moved as one. The lamp caught faces in slices, and the collars hummed like an insect swarm turned ritual. My feet had the bare memory of the path. Now they knew where the ground might betray us. The trench breathed around us, and the smoke that curled up from the burned timbers hung low and oily. Ahead, the sap gaped like a mouth that would accept whatever we put into it and chew at the offerings without thanks. I stepped forward into that mouth because the ledger had built a bridge I could not refuse. The collar at my throat sang, low and patient, and I answered it by keeping my shoulders square and my breath even. The world narrowed to the measured interval between my boots and the next rung of earth, and I held myself ready to bend or break, whichever the day demanded. The parapet was hotter than my collar. Heat rose off the stone in waves and rolled straight into my face, tasted of iron and old smoke. Through the slit, I could see the ruined courtyard where the enemy had made a nest, sandbags stacked like the bones of something too big to bury, steel latticework, a slit gun glinting inside a dark mouth. Someone ahead of me hissed, and the sound was swallowed by the thud of distant artillery. I had grenades in both hands because that was what the order was. Clear the bunker with nothing but our bodies and the small, cheap explosions we could keep close. The commissar rode our flank like a storm. He did not shout. His voice reached us through the sergeant's bark and the click of brass on leather. Every step he took in that raised saddle was a second risk we could not refuse. I had seen him once before remove a man's helmet with a single wordless gesture. The man had been mid-apology, the commissar's sleeve had been finger iron, and the man's mouth stopped trying to move. We all pulled our breath in then, exactly like that. I stepped out, my boot found rubble, then air, then a slope of packed earth. The world turned into small, immediate things. Heat, weight, the rubber of the grenades doing their own soft thrum against my palms. The collar bit into my neck with a dull, metallic press every time I swallowed. It was there like a judgment, hot and humming. You could not think past it. You did not plan. You reacted. Ahead, a man named Sordo. His voice had the permanent sand scratch of someone who had smoked too much fear, took 2 steps and folded. He did not scream. The sound was an impact, a wet sound that the dust hid. You learned quickly which noises meant what. That one meant he would not get back up. The commissar's boot touched the boardwalk, and he pointed, an invisible pointer, as sure as a blade. And the sergeant, a thin warble of a man 2 decades older than his eyes admitted, shoved us forward again. We ran because the ground demanded it, and because not running invited the collar. I remember the way gravel skittered under boots and the taste of grit on my tongue. The first embrasure was closer than it should have been. A slit gun barked, and my ear went thin and high, like paper torn. Someone between me and the wall dropped like a sack of grain and took the edge of the blast for us. He did not look at me when he hit the deck. That became the ledger of the day. Grenades were made to be felt. They were cool until they were not. I crouched behind a fallen gator of concrete, and there was the tiny ritual. Thumb over spoon, wind in breath, finger counted. You learn to make 100 silent bargains in those seconds, to decide quickly what you would and would not be remembered for. I thought of nothing. I thought of the way the commissar did not blink. I stood, launched an arm, and let the grenade go because someone had told me once that action muddied the aim of grief. It arced in a small, clean parabola and hit the sandbags like a comet, and then the world filled with sound and pressure. The noise did not feel like it belonged to me. It belonged to the stone and the men and the air. The sandbags billowed, and something inside the slit bed toppled outward. Wood, a smell like hot metal and old cloth, and the first of them screamed. We moved into that scream. The line we formed was less a line and more a machine whose parts did not care who was already broken. I grabbed the next grenade and counted again. Behind me, someone muttered a prayer to an unnamed god. The commissar's presence made even blasphemy imprecise and efficient. His eyes swept the formation and settled on a boy 2 ranks ahead, and the boy squared his shoulders as if he had a choice about his breathing. There were rules that were not rules. You did not hesitate. You did not look back when someone fell. You did not let the accusing silence of the caller be broken by the louder silence of a mutiny. A man who paused to help someone caught, instead, an eye from the commissar and was given the sort of reprimand that spent a man's life in a single word. The penalty was swift and public. It was not only the other men that taught you to move, it was the idea of cold steel seated just behind your nape. We chewed forward across the courtyard, and the smells changed. Burnt oil, sour sweat, the faint sweetness of scorched grain. There were things of home in the smells, and the recognition made my mouth ache. I thought of a woman from before this life, a name I had decided to keep only like a secret in my teeth. The collar did not like secrets. It hummed like a whole hive whenever I let that memory grow too large, and the vibration was enough to make the world real and immediate again. The second embrasure was a trap. The gunners had learned from the first, and now they were clever. They had set up crossfire, and the scream that welcomed us this time was wide and raw. The ground shuddered, and a man to my left rocked as if someone had grabbed him by the ribs. He did not call out. He only slid, and his eyes found mine for a fraction of a heartbeat, shocked, alive, still. And then he was gone under the dust. The commissar's shadow fell over the dying spot like a verdict. No reprieve. We were not mindless automatons. There was skill in the chaos. A soldier 2 ranks up, dark with the dust of 100 campaigns, executed a roll over a length of shattered masonry and came up firing a stub laser head liberated from a ruined sentry. The sound of it was low and mechanical, and where its beam cut the darkness, the defenders flinched. We took advantage, piling into the gap his bullets had opened. A man we did not know took 2 steps beyond the line and then folded in on himself. Something about his face did not look surprised. He looked like a man who had known the angle of incoming lead and decided to bow out early. We moved with the feeling of too few hands trying to close a wound. My lungs burned, but not as much as the collar's constant heat. Smoke braided our vision and made the world look half-sculpted, like an altar. I tossed grenades into the openings we found, and each time another part of the human nest inside rearranged itself or stopped moving entirely. The explosions were imported focus points. They took the abstract terror of the fortified position and made it solid for a moment. Glass and dirt and bodies that were not mine. A voice behind me said my name, and it was Varric, low and urgent. He had always had hands that found things quickly. He was the one who could drag a man under a lip of wall and change the angle of a dying man's luck. He shoved me up and whispered, "Left," then through. He didn't make it sound like a request. I went left. We found the inner corridor by crawling and by borrowing the courage of others. The air inside was cool and smelled like iron and old blankets. In the dim, a figure half hidden on a parapet raised a hand to sling a grenade, and I saw, close up, the same calculation in his face that had been in mine a dozen times that morning. He looked younger when you looked too long. He seemed surprised by what he had to do. And then he threw a quick arc, and the grenade landed curled up in a corner like a stupid animal. It detonated and the wall flaked away in a fine, soft rain of plaster. The figure on the parapet was thrown back and did not get up. We were learning what numbers and noise together could do. The cost was the holes left in our line. A man named Rill rubbed his cheek with the same hand that had once fed a girl his last ration of bread. He cursed quietly and then reached for another grenade. His face was an inventory of all the small debts a soldier carries. The commissar moved like wind through the men, no small gestures, only the abrupt ones. He tapped his saber against the rim of the last broken kata before the final doorway, and his lips shaped a word that everyone heard without hearing. It was a permission and a threat, and it meant that there would be no turning back now. We shouldered the mouth of the corridor like a collective animal, and then we were at the threshold of the bunker itself. In the doorway, the light from outside painted every problem in stark lines. The defenders inside were patched with shadows, and the slats of their weapons glittered like teeth. Between me and them lay a narrow stretch of hard, beaten earth and a single explosion's worth of luck. My hands were breathing in the metal of the grenades. The small familiarity made my muscles remember how to move. I glanced to my left and found the commissar watching me. He did not smile. He did not need to. His mouth was a straight, thin line that had been given to men who would not be shown mercy. I thought of what lay in the room beyond the doorway. Maybe a machine, maybe waiting men, maybe another hole in the world that would not be noticed until too late. I thought also with an animal clarity of survival as a motion rather than a plan. There is, in those final seconds, a clarity that strips language from you. The collar thrummed. The weight of the grenades was a small, inconvenient truth in my hands. The sergeant pushed my shoulder, and somewhere behind me, a man cursed brilliantly and briefly at an absent god. I stepped over the threshold and the smell hit me. Closer now, iron and oil, and a faint sweetness that could have been the breath of something alive under dirt. The corridor inside the bunker waited like a throat. I pulled the pin on one grenade because the muscle knew the cadence, and the simple motion kept my mind from breaking. The spoon was bitter under my thumb. I kept my other hand free for a weapon I did not yet need. The plan, such as it was, became a single shape. Make noise, make space, keep moving. The fight would tell us what it wanted, with whoever remained to stand in it. As I took that step forward, the world narrowed to the weight of the grenade and the fact that moving was an action remembered better than any prayer. My boot found the next slab of floor, and the commissar's eyes narrowed, as if measuring whether I had enough left inside me to survive. The light inside, the bunker shifted. Something moved at the far end, a shadow cutting the air. I could smell the hot of someone's breath. I lifted my arm. I was going in. The first wall fell like a tired god, slowly at first, then with a terrible hurry that threw brick and light and men into one hot, choking cloud. dust filled my mouth, grit ground against my teeth. I could feel the heat from the blast through the leather of my vest, could feel the cold bite of the collar's metal ring at the base of my skull, where the governor's schism-proof band sat against my spine like an accusation. Someone behind me cursed, a short, sharp sound that got cut off when a slab tumbled past and took his legs on the way out. The world narrowed to the sound of wood splintering, the smell of copper and wiring, and the urgent human calculus of a moment that would not wait for conscience to line up its reasons. Orders arrived as blunt things. "Seal the breach," the sergeant barked through the conduit of the vox clipped to his throat. His voice was a saw. He didn't ask if anyone agreed. He named a tactic: sacrifice or die in formation. There was no idle rhetoric about valor here, no stirring words to make desperate things beautiful. He said what any officer says when they've been backed against a rule and a tribunal. We would pay with flesh now to save the rest. In the room, where plaster smoked and the frame of the wall gaped like an open ribcage, he tapped the detonator on his belt, the hard, ceremonial slap of someone reminding us what our collars meant. The tag hummed under his finger. He didn't show mercy, he offered choices. 3 options uncoiled in my head, each as narrow as a blade. I could throw myself on Corporal Reeve, press my body between him and the falling girder, and let my weight keep his spine intact. I could shove one of the green boys through the breach, force them into the flames as a temporary plug, lose one to save many. Or I could do what the sergeant suggested, trigger a collar to create a controlled collapse, seal the opening with someone's body and the blast. The detonator tag embedded in our belts, small, cold, ridiculous, had a name only the officers used when they wanted you to stop thinking of men as brothers and start thinking of them as assets. They called it discipline. We called it the governor's bite. Reeve looked at me with that thin, resigned grin that said he'd done this before. He was coughing dust painted the whites of his eyes gray. His arm hung wrong. He'd been our point, a man who stepped into danger because the roster said he should. I saw his mouth move, but the words were a jumble of mucus and grit. He could not climb his weight, was the wrong kind of liability. The sergeant's hand rested on my shoulder with the lightness of an ultimatum. His words were quieter now, almost private. "You're the one with the steady hands," he said. "You pull, we live." There was no thank you in it. There was only the understanding that someone had to be small enough to be erased, and that my erasure would be judged practical rather than monstrous. The collar waiting at Reeve's throat had the same cold ring as my own. Up close, the metal looked less like a tool and more like a hinge. It argued in the language of engineering that a person could be turned into leverage. The detonator in the sergeant's palm was a little puck of lacquered metal. It fit my hand like a lie fits a mouth. When he handed it to me, his fingers left a smear of sweat that felt like a brand. I took the puck because not taking it would have been another kind of choice. My fingers closed around the switch. The weight of it was nothing, then everything. I remember thinking for a ridiculous, distant instant about how we had been told the collars were for our protection, that if a man tried to bolt for the Xenos or the heretic, the collar would keep him tethered to the unit and to his chains. That was the line they fed the recruits to stop panic in barracks. The truth tasted different in the stale air of the collapsed corridor. Collars were for obedience. They were for making moral math snap clean. Officers used them to enforce desperate tactics, because desperate tactics need someone to bear the final arithmetic. The sergeant's face was flat. In that way, authority flattens things that cannot argue back. When I put my finger on the puck, the corridor seemed to hold its breath. Reeve tried to lift his head. He spat something wet onto the floor. A beam groaned somewhere to our left, a reminder that the structure did not forgive hesitation. I thought of all the mornings I had woken to the collar's kiss, of the tiny rituals, rubbed the metal, whisper a prayer to an absent saint, imagine a future where the band lay idle, and how those rituals were laughter now, useless superstition against the machinery of command. I told myself the sergeant would have killed us all if we did nothing. I told myself we were buying a ledger entry where our sin was measured in numbers and the commissar's displeasure was a thing a man could avoid with a single flash of heat. Rationalization is a dull blade, but it cuts. My thumb pressed down. The sound was a soft click, like a hinge after years of disuse, and then the world changed its geometry. There was a pressure wave that did not feel like an explosion so much as a sentence finally executed. Dust exploded outward in a shimmering sheet. The beam above the breach bowed and snapped in a single, obedient arc, and Reeves' body folded into the hollow as though the building had been waiting to accept him. There was no sound of ripping. The world had arranged itself, so the action was clinical. Smoke ran into my face and tasted of hot metal. For an instant, the corridor was a place without faces, only the impression of absence where a man had been, and the rest of us were actors with too little light to read the script. We moved for the new opening as if the world demanded speed more than breath. The sealed hole held the rubble shifted and settled into an ugly, efficacious plug. Sergeant did not look at me when I handed back the puck. His jaw worked. He said nothing that could be called comfort. The boys ahead of me, two of them who had joined the Legion last season and still believed the colors might have meaning, stared at their boots. One of them vomited quietly behind a bent support. The air tasted faintly of ozone and something older that might have been regret. No one thanked me. There was nothing in the manual about gratitude after you had put a man into mortar, and mortar had accepted him. The commissar's office at the rear would log the casualty with a number and a cause that sounded more like a weather report than a verdict. Later, in the heatless hours between watch changes, someone would tell the story with the blunt heroics that keep the rank and file moving. How a man gave his life to seal the breach, how discipline held, and how the unit moved on. The truth of it would be quieter and more corrosive. I had decided for him, not with him. I had chosen which of us would be bred for the engine. I woke later in a fever dream of cold collars and warm blood, though there was no blood left to dream about. Memory tends to be imprecise where morality is thickest. I could recall the smell of a boot leather scuffed against stone, the sergeant's hand on my shoulder, Reeves' eyes as the world closed. I could not recite any absolution, only the echo of the click and the way the corridor looked afterward, as if something had been edited out of it. The rest of the squad moved faster then, driven by the knowledge that the commissar would ask questions, and that questions in the hand of authority are as dangerous as bullets. We had bought time and lost a man. The ledger balanced itself in either direction. There was an immediacy to what came next. The sergeant ordered us to push through the sealed section, to take the first stair and secure the courtyard beyond. The colony's alarm still wailed in the distance, a thin thread that promised reinforcements or reprisal, and the idea of waiting for tribunal men to arrive with notebooks and sentences was unbearable. We climbed. Every step stubbed into the memory of what we had done. My collar at my throat felt heavier than before, like a judge settling on its bench. I thought suddenly about the device on my belt, the detonator puck, and realized none of us were safe from the same calculus. The officer who had given me the choice still had the puck in his hand. His thumb stroked it the way a gambler toys with chips. As we reached the top of the stair, the courtyard at last opened up under a sky that was the wrong color. The light there was thin and washed, like an old photograph exposed too long. Movement in the far archway caught my eye. Figures in ragged uniforms who might have been militia or scavengers hunched against the ruined statues. For a second, the world offered a new choice: to engage and risk the commissar's wrath should we fail, to hold position and invite questioning or to abandon the place where a man had been made into a plug and run until the collar warmed our necks to a stop. The sergeant's voice cut through my thoughts like a file. "Form up," he said. "We take it now." His certainty made the decision simple for everyone but me. I tightened my grip on my rifle, though my fingers tasted like dust. The weight of the detonator in my memory was a small, hot coal at the edge of everything. I had saved the squad by condemning a friend. That fact lay like a living thing in my chest, moving and breathing and impossible to ignore. I could feel the future arranging itself, shaping each heartbeat into the arithmetic of survival and sacrifice. The sergeant moved forward, and the rest of us followed, boots clattering on broken stone, collars humming softly against skin. I told myself that the only way forward was through, that everything else was either cowardice or a slower kind of death. In the courtyard's pale light, I took a step and wondered how many more times I would be asked to choose, and whether choosing would always mean running my hands over the cold metal at my throat. The collar woke me before the bells. Heat bloomed under the metal like a fist, a slow, precise pressure that let me know the compound's hardo circuits were awake. It was the same prick of shame every morning, the strap that told me where I belonged until command decided otherwise. I lay still until the searing dulled to that familiar ache. Movement made it flare. So I listened to the sleeping men around me breathe and count the calories of silence. By the time the wardens unlocked the outer gates, the market had begun. It was never a proper market. It was barter beneath the lash, a shifting economy grown from hunger and fear. I had my share of things to trade, knowledge of which Sentry slept with his bayonet cocked, a limp bootlace knotted to hide a contraband shard, the promise of silence about a favor taken in a stairwell 1 month back. Others had worse currency. A man with a protruding tooth sold an extra spoonful of porridge for a night where he took another's punishment. A woman skinned her voice and sold prayers to men who wanted the commissar to think them repentant. We traded in small deaths, favors, silences, beatings, the smallest betrayals that kept you alive another dawn. A boy named Jor gave me half his ration for a story about home. He swallowed the words like they were water. I told him about a field of pale grain, nothing like Terra, I added, to keep him from asking what his mother looked like. Story was an easy trade. It cost me little and bought him a dream. Other trades were uglier. The whisper that a transfer aboard a black ship might be bought carried like smoke through the barracks. Men heard it and rubbed their collars, because a black ship was not mercy. It was an old woman's promise, either the end or a second kind of sentence. Still, it was a currency. If you whispered the right names to the right ear, you might be spared the day-to-day collapse into nothing. The market moved in small, ugly rituals. A knuckle tap meant you paid for protection from a night watch beating. An extra strip of cloth in a boot told the recruiter you would do his dirty jobs. Men traded their stories, their beds, and their names. I traded less, kept more. I had a friend, Cade. He was rough as an old boot and soft in ways that confused the men around him. He shared his jacket when the rain came. He held my gaze when the rest of the world looked away. I was not blind to the arithmetic that ruled us. I had seen men cut their own hands free of collars to sell the mangled leather. I had seen a man kneel and beg for a black ship transfer like a salvation, though what came back on those hulls was seldom what was promised. Command called me before the cookhouse emptied. Sergeant Voss, one name, no more, stood as if the sun had carved him from iron. He had a way of pressing his attention that made the room smaller. He did not smile. He offered me a cigarette the size of a twig and then took it away before I could light it. His hands smelled of grease and the cold tang of discipline. "You want to live longer than the rest?" he asked, and it was a question and an assessment sewn into one. I answered with silence, because silence had bought me things before. He told me about a mission no one else wanted. He described it as a gap that needed filling, a dead zone beyond the ridge where the enemy's patrols thinned and the wreckage of a downed courier cooked in the sun. The task was simple by language: retrieve a sealed canister from the courier's remains and bring it back intact. The language was always simple. The truth in these offers lurked beneath the words, all teeth and contract. If I did it, he said, my collar would be loosened until a replacement crew arrived. I would be given a table at the supply depot. I would not be listed among the morning's dead. He used the bureaucrat's phrase, conditional reprieve. He spoke of paperwork like it could be fattening. And if I refuse? I asked. He leaned forward. Refusal is a decision too. It will be noted. Then he added the price like a footfall in the dark. I would either betray a man or carry out the mission and accept a concession afterward. The man he meant by that name was Cade. Voss did not pretend the two options were equal. Betrayal would be decisive and quick. The mission would be slow and would require a concession I could not die my way out of. Either route would take my freedom and leave me with something worse, a change in the bones of who I was. I knew how betrayals worked in here. The ledger of favors hung invisible in the corridors. Turn in a comrade, and you might earn an officer's trust for a time. Sign a confession that another tried to desert, and the Black Ship's manifests might whisper your name slightly less often. They used us as counters on a dirty board and offered us a sliver of breathing room for the price of what made us human. Told Voss nothing. He named the hour and the moment, sundown beyond the ridge. He slid a small token across the table, a stamped coin that meant someone was taking an interest in me. It was enough to make men look at you in a new way. It was dangerous and glinting. I pocketed it because a body learns to take what it is given. Outside, sunlight peeled like old paint off the barracks walls. The market still spun its deals. Cade came up behind me and slapped my shoulder in a way that was meant to be ordinary. His breath smelled like smoke and a bitter herb he used to clear his throat. He asked, casual, if I had seen the new recruits. I lied. I did not want to break his smile. That night, the air cooled and callers hummed contents of their own. I thought of the canister like a bright thing sleeping in the bones of wreckage. The thought of retrieving it became a muscle I could flex away from the point Voss had made sharp. If I went after it and came back, I imagined a table, a porcelain plate, the sound of cutlery that did not tell me how to eat. If I betrayed Cade, I imagined his eyes on me when the new ledger came down, the kind of disgust that did not look for mercy. Between those options, something else crouched, the concession. Voss had said it would haunt the person I still tried to be. He used the phrase as if I had more than one person inside me. I did. One of my faces remembered a woman who had braided my hair and told me that names were like bread. Do not waste them. Another face remembered the first time a collar squeezed the breath out of me and taught me how a place could be marked on a body by heat alone. I feared what I might be asked to give up, and because fear is practical, I cataloged possibilities. Maybe they would want me to mark Cade as a deserter. Maybe they would want the canister, sealed and unbroken, because what it held was a list of men who had already been promised to inquisitorial hands. Maybe they wanted a confession I would have to speak into a recorder, my voice condemning someone I loved. The law in this place was thin and hung like drying flesh. They could always craft a reason and bind it with ribbons of paper. Cade and I shared a cigarette behind the supply sheds, our collars a small heat between us. He spoke of his mother with a tenderness that made me raw. He told me about a time he had stolen a loaf for her and been slapped by his father. He liked to speak of small things, as if they were the only anchors left. I wanted to tell him everything. Instead, I tucked my mouth around the ember and watched the smoke make small ghosts in the air. The market kept turning. Trades were made and unnoticed. A man sold his name to get a blanket. Another sold his pride for a place in the latrine queue. We were all measuring losses and making choices. When I walked away, I felt the weight of the token inside my pocket like a second collar. That night, I did the thing men in my position do. I pretended to sleep and let the future creep closer like a predator. Sleep came and did not come. I listened to the sounds of breathing and the rattle of chains, to the distant clank of a vehicle wheel against a gravel road. I imagined the wrecked courier still warm with the sun, something in it humming, secret, alive, dangerous. Dawn found me at the ridge. Voss did not come. He could not be seen at that hour for the way it preserved him. The field beyond the ridge was already bright with a light that made everything honest and cruel. The sentries muttered about patrol routes. I moved among them as if I belonged, because once in here you do belong to some degree. Fear lubricates shape. The wreck lay like a small dead god. Metal peeled back into ribs. The canister sat where the courier had been pinned by the shock of something else, half buried in dust and old ledger slips. It was simple to take in distance and harder up close. The seal hummed an odd frequency, like a shallow prayer, like a trap. I wrapped my hands around it and felt a small pulse in my palms. Hands pick up histories. This one had a label under the dust, a code, nothing I understood. The thing fit into the crook of my arm like a child. I thought then of the ledger Voss had shown me in his office, of names and smears. The concession he wanted trembled in the margins of that thought. The canister might be a key, the mission might be a test, or it might be a way to get me to carry a thing across a boundary, and when it was opened, find Cade's name inside with the word deserter next to it. The worst bargains were always layered. I wrapped the canister in a strip of my jacket and began to walk back. Each step made my breath short. The ridge thickened behind me like a memory. The sun burned a path ahead so bright I had to narrow my eyes. Men in this place learned how to carry guilt like a meal. They chewed on it when the voices were quiet. I could feel it now, sour and hot in my stomach. About halfway back, a shadow detached itself from the ruined courier and stepped forward. I did not hear the movement. Fear had the advantage of making things silent. Cade's face lifted. He stared at the canister in my arms. For a second, neither of us spoke. The air between us held a kind of accusation that neither word could soften. His eyes slid to the token in my pocket and then back to my hands. "You did it," he said. "Not a question. I did what I had to do. I lied. The most dangerous thing about lies in this place is how soon they are found out." Cade's jaw set. He reached out and touched the fabric he'd wrapped around the canister. His fingers were calloused. "Where are you taking it?" he asked. "Not to Voss." "Not yet." "Back to command," I said. "They're doing something with it. For our unit." The words tasted like thin metal in my mouth. Cade's face folded in a way that broke open something inside me. For a moment I saw what the concession might ask. If I walked away now, if I handed what was hidden in my jacket to the very people who had told me the price of getting out, I would be carrying betrayal like an offering. If I refused and carried the canister into the night as an independent act, I would be defying Voss and everything he represented. And if I did what the sergeant had suggested, if I signed a name, if I let the patina of paper and procedure do my dirty work, Cade might be the sacrifice that guaranteed my table. We stood there in the broken light while the market of the barracks kept spinning, oblivious to the small pivot taking place in a ruined field. The canister hummed on my arm. The token burned in my pocket. Cade waited with the patient, terrible hope of men who trusted another not to throw them away. I could picture the ledger again, the neat columns that would be changed with one scratch of a pen. I could smell the porridge and the metal of collars and the stale sweat where men made bargains. The decision narrowed like a blade. For a breath, I felt the shape of it, the clean edge. Betray. Do not betray. Carry out the mission without conceding the one thing they wanted. Then I lifted my head and walked back toward the camp, the sun at my back and the canister heavy at my side. Cade fell in step beside me without being asked. We did not speak. The ridge swallowed our shadows. My collar tingled like a warning. Somewhere ahead, Voss waited with his hands folded and paperwork ready. Behind me, the ruin kept its secrets. I walked because I had to, not because I knew what I would give up at command's table, and not because I planned to keep what was left of myself intact. I reached the gate with the canister under my jacket and the token in my palm. The smell of oil and old leather signaled the exercise yard. Men watched us pass and looked away. They had already chosen which faces of themselves they would sell. Cade's fingers closed around mine for a moment, a quick, human pressure that felt like an apology or a plea. I kept my gaze forward. In the office, Voss unsealed a sheet and tapped a pen against the edge. "Everything you bring back will be rewarded," he said. His voice was flat, a promise wrapped in the machinery of command. I knew the sentence he intended to deliver. I knew, too, that the price might not be written on paper at all. It would be signed by my tongue, by the arc of my hand, by what I allowed to happen in the dark. I set the canister on the desk between us and felt the weight of more than metal. It was then I understood fully what Voss had meant by a concession that would haunt me. Freedom would be purchased with something that could not be returned, a silence sworn into the mouths of men, a name crossed off the living, the knowledge that my hands had chosen one life over another. Voss looked at Cade. Cade looked back at him. I watched the three of us in a line, like a scale about to tip. The pen hovered. Outside, the barracks kept the steady barter of survival. Inside, the drop of a decision trembled above us. I placed my hand over the canister and felt that small, impossible stillness. Then I reached for the token in my pocket, and before the pen fell, I made a move that would begin to answer the question command had set for me. The ledger lay open between us, its pages a poor geography of names and crosses, and the little marks that meant someone still counted. A corporal knelt beside it, his gloved finger running along an inked line, and every time the nib scraped the paper, I felt it like a small stone dropped into my chest. The collar warmed against my throat, the skin beneath had started to peel, where metal never stopped learning my shape. I listened to its tiny clicks, as if it were the only clock left that belonged to me. They scratched a name out, and for a moment, the world was only paper and the rasp of steel. The first white line the corporal made dimmed the face in my head until it became nothing but a place where a name had been. I knew the way the ink lifted now, short, efficient strokes, no ceremony, and I knew why they did it that way. Mercy, I had believed once, had a sound like a bell. This was a sound like a file. The name smudged and vanished, and somewhere down the corridor, a laugh died inside someone else's throat. I did not say anything. Saying makes muscle. I had to keep mine soft. They granted me a transfer. The phrase felt like a coin hammered thin. On paper, it was clean and sharp. Transfer approved. Spoken, it was a promise that could be shouted into the void. Practically, it meant a new tag, a new formation number, a long train trip of iron and men, and the stale breath of crowded holds. It meant surviving one more bloodless morning and walking into another where someone else might not. The ledger's edge cut my thumb. I left a smear of my own blood on the margin beside the stamped seal, because that was the only mark left I could make that would not be taken away. You survive a mission and people cheer because their lives were not the ones wagered. They never hear the small things that die, There was a pocket in my jacket where I kept a torn photograph, two faces smiling like they were not waiting for the next order. The photo was singed at the corner. I folded it around my finger until the paper softened and the image blurred. Each memory you fold protects itself by becoming smaller. I had become excellent at folding. Mornings under the collar are louder than nights. At night, the world is a rumor of engines and insect life, the smell of hot oil, and the distant surge of artillery like a far-off storm. But morning is hands and faces, rations, and the calculations of who will be moving where. The collar wakes before I do. I felt it like a distant animal in my throat, and because the collar is designed to remind you of debts you cannot hold, it made me count. I counted my stitches, the holes in my boots, the names still written in the ledger. Counting kept panic lazily at bay. Counting is neutral. Counting was all they asked of me. I learned to trade pieces of myself for the barest continuance of breath. Oh, first it was small things, an oath left unsaid, a lie told to cover a man's absence. Then it was turning away from a friend who raised his head in the muck. Later still, it was letting a corporal win the collar tighter because the new seal was necessary for the records. Each concession sounded small in the moment. Each one left a little sound in my chest, like a coin dropped into a well and never retrieved. When I lay down now, I could hear the coins clink in the dark. They gave me a new number and a new billet, and they took a shoulder's worth of names from me like trimming dead branches. The ledger had always been a ledger in the most literal sense, accounts kept by men who bought a few more days with their bravery. But that day it became confession as well as account. I watched them scratch lines, and I remembered promises. Those promises were not important to the Imperium. To survive within its teeth, you learn how to make promises into tools, useful, then discarded. My eyes moved over the empty bunks, one after another, and I mapped who had been scratched away. There was a cadence to the emptiness, a boot here, a cigarette stub there, a voice that used to say something obscene and comforting when the rain hammered like fists. They had simply been removed in ink, and the world adjusted its gravity to the absence. They sent me to assemble my kit. My hands, trained to the ritual of packing and unpacking, obeyed before my head did. I folded the blanket with military precision, folded my regret into the seam. The collar continued to hum its machinery, song against bone. It was a thin instrument, like a violin being tuned, never quite in tune. Every pull of a strap jangled it. The corporal watched me with eyes that were half pity and half ledger. Pity does not unmake debt, it only counts it differently. On the transit barge, the air smelled of iron and boiled meat. Men played cards with rules that changed every hand. They spoke of home as if distance could be smoothed by saying the names fast enough. I sat quiet because a quiet man is cheap to keep. Around me were those who had learned how to compartmentalize, joy kept in a tin, grief strapped with twine. The collar sat against the wind and tasted of ozone and metal. When the captain barked an order, the collar clicked like a lock acknowledging the command. They issued us new orders in a language of grids and grids of grids. My transfer listed coordinates and a sentinel post to which I would be attached, a place where the worth of a man was measured in how long he could stand in a line without flinching. They also issued a line of text in smaller print that was not read aloud. Subjects release conditional upon further service. It was a polite clause that functioned as a chain. You do not get absolution in that system. You buy reprieve. That nuance is a medicine people swallow without tasting. I had taken it before. The ledger was still burning in my bag. I would not hand it back. Names scratched out would be names I kept within. There was a strange ethics to that. If the state erased a man, keeping his name was an act of insolence. To keep a name alive was to refuse the ledger's finality. So I folded pages into the lining, tucking memory beside metal and breath. The collar hummed approval when my hand touched the paper. It is likely coincidence, but when you live with an instrument designed to repress you, meaning creeps into its smallest noises. What hurts is not the deaths themselves, it is how they recalibrate you. After enough absences, you measure your life by their shadow. You learn to set aside a portion of your feeling, like coins in a pouch for a future day when you can no longer pay. The pouch never fills. It becomes its own weight. I met a surgeon once who had a collection of tiny chess pieces carved from bone. He said he kept them so the pieces could speak for those who could not. He offered me one then, carved clumsily, the Black Knight. I declined because taking a thing like that obliges you to remember it, and remembering is currency I no longer afford easily. There are concessions that slice the soul into useful fragments. You begin to rationalize. You tell yourself that the man you left was already dead because it simplifies the arithmetic. You say it quietly at first, then the phrase grows and smooths until it is your default setting. The collar learned the cadence of that phrase faster than I did. It hummed softer when I said it because the sound matched the machine's own belief that pain could be quantified and dispensed. I resented the collar for agreeing with me. Night on the outpost is not dark. Lights burn with the steady clinical glow of oversight. The sentinel towers pierce the horizon like blunt teeth. I stood watch and watched the ledger more than the perimeter. The entries had become a map to ghosts. The ledger was a substitute Bible. I read a line and prayed, not for salvation, but for accuracy. I wanted the count to reflect something true enough for me to trust. But truth is a dangerous commodity in places governed by necessity and ink. When the transfer order came through the morning shift, I pretended not to hear. I stacked cases and labeled them with calloused fingers. Packing is a form of prayer. You lay out what matters and find it all fits into the spaces life has allotted you. I put the ledger in the last crate under a bundle of ration tins. I sealed it and wrote my new number on the outside. It felt obscene to label memory. The collar thudded a rhythm against my pulse. It had, in a way, become the only honest metronome left. Outside, the sky turned the color of cheap metal. The transport engines coughed, a sound like a funeral dirge trying to pass for optimism. Men moved with a mechanical purpose. Some kissed their knees as if to impart courage. Others spat into the dust and smiled thinly. The ledger was at my feet. I thought of reclaiming a single name, of unfolding the photograph and calling out into the wind, not expecting an answer. There were thin threads left connecting me to what I had been, frayed and yet carrying weight. To cut them would be to become wholly useful. I stepped forward and felt the collar's warmth surge, a private reprimand. A guard looked at me and did not ask. He had already learned what questions cost. The transport door was a dark mouth that inhaled us in a single motion. I shouldered my pack and felt the ledger's corners press against my spine like a confession. There was a motion I had not made in a long time, a small, defiant thing. I reached into the lining and touched one scraped-out name as if it were a coin in a well, felt the papery edge and the ghost of ink. I did not say it aloud. I folded that silence around me so the sound could not be taxed. The collar clicked once and then again, a single staccato that was neither warning nor blessing. It was sound that belonged inside me now. I walked to the transport and mounted the ramp. The engines swallowed our boots' echoes. Behind me, the compound became a smear of lights, and the ledger a half-hidden relic. Ahead, the sentinel towers slid past like teeth, cogs in a machine that thought of men as parts. My number flexed in my palm like a splinter. I did not know if I would ever write a name back on a page using indelible ink. I only knew the rhythm of the collar and how it matched the decision that had taken shape in my chest. to keep paying, not out of loyalty to any banner, but because it is easier to be alive in small increments than to die all at once. The transport bulked around me. The men inside rearranged their lives into positions of silence. Somewhere forward lay that new billet, a place where the ledger would keep counting, and I would learn new ways to trade away pieces of myself. I kept the sound of the collar in my chest like a coin pressed against bone and stepped towards whatever came next, knowing that living would require me to keep putting one small, painful payment after another into a slot that would never be full.